Hi, friends, and welcome. Welcome to a session on standardized testing. The title officially is Creating Your Standardized Testing Plan. I'm joined by one of my favorite people in this field and in this world, Jed Applerouth, whom you'll meet shortly. Jed, say hello to the people.
People, great to be here. My pleasure.
I'm going to let Jed give a slightly longer intro to himself in just a few minutes. But before we get started, I've got a poll in the Zoom platform. Curious if you're a student, parent, or counselor who's out there, and we put a link to a form that is essentially an opportunity for you to win a free book. And it allows us to get to know you all a little bit better as we're creating new things as the days and weeks roll on. Big picture today, we're going to talk about how do you know what the right test is for you? How do you know how many practice and official tests you should take? We'll zoom back at some point and ask, should you even test? Like, what are the benefits of taking standardized tests or not? If you do decide to do it, how much should you prepare? Over what length of time? We'll get into those details. And then we're going to talk a little about this digital SAT and what impacts that could have on all the things. Before we get into that, some quick PSAs. We've got a cool course coming up this summer that you might have heard about. Maybe you didn't. It's on writing a personal statement. It's with yours truly. It's a 4-week course. It's pay what you can, which means there's no financial barrier to joining. There are barriers to joining, like you have to click the button. That's a barrier for some students, but hopefully not too high of a barrier. And then I've got a second course on writing the application and supplemental essays. And then for counselors, if there are any counselors on the session tonight, we've got another separate course on designing and building a successful, or actually we changed it to an effective counseling program. We thought that effective was more descriptive than successful.
Yeah.
So what does success mean? How do we even define that?
Great.
So, well, with that, Jed, I want to kick it over to you and let you introduce yourself a little bit, give folks your background, and then I'm going to let you just take the floor and
just talk.
Yeah, and then I'm going to be standing by for if folks have questions, just throw them into the chat as they come up. Jed and I have a top secret behind the scenes Google Doc that we are sharing information on, but we will get your questions. So feel free to share them. All right, Jed, over to you.
Cool. All right. So when it comes down to me and testing, I got into the field back in 2001, before some of you I know were very, very little, and began working with kids on the SAT and then the ACT. I've seen it go through 3 big changes, and now we're on the cusp of the next one, the digital SAT, which is going to be a big shift in the field. I also watched the pandemic really throw testing upside down with the explosion of test optional admissions and what that means for kids. And, written a couple books, been working with students. We have a company called Applerouth Tutoring. We have hundreds of tutors. We work all over the country and the world with kids, getting them ready for the SAT and the ACT. So it really is my jam. It's my career for over 20 years, and happy to share some wisdom, things I've seen, and talk about how to think about this SAT and the ACT, and should I bother with it? How much time? All those things. All right, should I jump in and do some?
Let's do it. Let's do it.
All right, I'm going to share my screen, y'all. Hold for a moment, and then I will begin slideshow from beginning. Here we go. So about 15 minutes of slides. Let's jump into it. Testing. Scott looks pretty happy. All right, so there are two big tests. They've been around. College Board about 100 years. ACT out of Iowa City since 1959. They've been around a long time, and they're very close, but there are some differences. And if you're taking the SAT or ACT, you'll get to choose. There's no reason to take both. Colleges really don't care if you have a good score in both. Some kids submit both, but ultimately, if you have a good score, then you've checked the box for testing. The SAT is more advanced when it comes to reading level. It operates typically on about an 11th grade, 12th grade reading level. So they're going to throw at you some Shakespeare occasionally. They'll throw at you Emily Dickinson or Jane Eyre. The language level is higher, and it's been that way for a long time. That was especially part of the Common Core redesign in 2016. They have harder, more advanced passages. ACT, they got a standalone separate science section. So 40 science items. On the SAT, you have some science passages, but not straight. This is 7 passages, and it's science. And actually there is some outside knowledge in terms of structuring experiments and designs. And also you have much more advanced math. You're going to have more, we're talking some advanced trigonometry, You're going to have some pre-cal. Math you never ever see on the SAT. So you have more higher level reading on the ST, higher level STEM, math, science on the ACT. The overlap is about 80%. And this has been, they started off being very different. The ACT was the answer to the SAT because one was really more abstract and one was, it really wasn't tied to the high school curriculum. But then over time, they've been blending together. Now they're very similar. About 8/10 of the content overlaps in terms of reading skills, in terms of English and grammar skills, reading science, tables and graphs, some algebra and stats. So the difference, the 20% difference is meaningful. And that's where kids, they separate out after a baseline test. Am I going to do better on the SAT or the ACT? And some kids are in the range of indifference. They score in a similar fashion where it doesn't matter. But some kids, I'm just better on the ACT. I'm just better on the ST. And that is going to be the pathway to help yourself with college admissions and scholarships and so forth. All right, speed. The ACT is fast. You've got to go fast. The SAT is we have more space. And on the new digital test, even more space. It's really changing in that direction. You have about 40% more time per question when it comes to the ACT. And so, I'm sorry, on the SAT. You have to be faster and speedier on every measure of the ACT. Now, next up, the question is, how do I figure out, which way? Now, I recommend very strongly that everyone gets a dual baseline. And you could use your PSAT if your school does a PSAT. Or you go and do a practice test on the SAT. And ideally, you do a mock test, a practice of the ACT, and then compare them. Because if you type in concordance table comparison, there'll be a table, and you line them up by percentile. And so if I get a 26 on the ACT, that's effectively equivalent to a 1200 on the SAT. And if I get both those scores, I'm in the range of total indifference. It doesn't matter where I go. And there's about 30 points of error on each test. So if I get a 1240, that's about the same as a 26, or if I get, a 1170 and so forth. However, if I get more than that 30 points of error on each side, so if I get a 26 on the ACT, but then I get a 1300 on the SAT, well, I am done forever, with that ACT because my score is stronger. If I take it 7 times in a row, I'll probably keep getting better every time on the SAT. I'm beyond the margin of error. So that's it. So if you're less than that range of error, then you go with your preference. This one felt more comfortable. It felt better. But if you are mathematically advantaged on one, then you go with that one. Go with your easier one. Why make it hard on yourself? Ideally, as you build out your testing plan, you plan on taking the actual test 3 times. That is after looking at tens of thousands of student data points. And typically students see a nice bump from their first real test to the second, and then a smaller incremental bump. Often they go up in one section on their 3rd test. Most kids have peaked and maxed out by the 3rd actual test. There are some kids who are one and done. Some kids do a ton of practice, go in there, bang it out, and they're finished. Some kids are 2 and done, but typically we see over the course of, again, thousands of students, that most kids hit their top score after 3. And also the majority of colleges who take these things, they're going to super score the SAT, which means that I'll take my best verbal from March, my best math from June, and combine them. That's very, very common as a practice. So if I have a little bit of a better day on verbal, a little better day on math, those become the score they use when looking at my application committee. So taking it several times is to your advantage for a lot of reasons. You get more confidence as you do it. You have the possibility of just randomly getting a little better on one day than another. And also there is a testing effect where you become more confident, more masterful, more centered, taking it a few times. Now it's not a surprise. I know the timing, the pacing, the structure. I'm good to go on this test. Things that make testing more effective, kids who get higher scores. This was my doctoral thesis, was looking at what matters, what factors inform success on the SAT. And practice tests, they make a difference. Kids doing more practice tend to do better. When you spread things out over time, you tend to do better than kids who cram their sessions together closely. Yeah, it's hard to cram this thing. It's really more of a, over 8 weeks versus over 2 weeks kind of thing. Kids who start earlier tend to do better than those who wait late in their junior year, because when you go earlier, you have more time for practice, more time for homework, more time to kind of learn, relearn, and so forth. Kids who put in more time on task tend to do better. The student who spends 4 hours prepping for this test versus 35 typically you do better with 35 hours of prep. And there definitely is a point of diminishing returns, but doing only a few hours of prep, you would probably want your top score. And then having momentum towards the end, you don't want to do a big prep class in the summer, then wait 4 months and go in and take it cold. You want to have practice and at least one test of practice before every official administration, like a month prior. And then having a goal. Kids who have a goal in mind, they have a baseline test of a 25 on the ACT. My goal is a 29, or my goal is a 30, whatever the number is. Having a fixed goal you're working towards helps you calibrate progress. It's motivating, it's reinforcing as you keep hitting strides toward your ultimate goal. All right. You have 7 ACTs every year, and you have 7 SATs every year. So your testing plan, you got to figure out, get your baseline in and figure out, am I going the path of the ACT? Am I going the path of the SAT? And then look at the dates and try to figure out where it makes sense. It makes sense typically in the period of time when you're in your school year where it's not crazy for you. Some of you are going to be taking a lot of advanced classes, dual enrollment, APs, IBs. Some of you may be the leads in your school plays or your varsity, your debate team, your wrestling team, student government. The whole thing is, where do I find a spot where it's not nuts, or it's relatively less nuts for those who are very overscheduled? And say, you know what, it might be that November, December window is better for me. Some kids, you know what, that spring window, some kids, it's summertime. I'm going to be able to do that June, July, September ACT. So it's trying to figure out, and don't worry about, is there an easy or hard test date? That isn't a thing. That's a myth. But it really matters of when in your schedule this makes more sense to you. I mentioned super scoring. That's a visual. Verbal best in that 670 was in March, and then verbal in June, and together that's my score. Bingo. And now we'll pivot momentarily to this, the new world. It's an optional environment for testing, unless you're applying to MIT or Georgetown or the Florida schools or the military academies or UGA or Tech. There really are now it's Purdue, and there are a few schools, fewer than 30, essentially, where it's required. And that's equivalent to those where that doesn't matter, where it's blind. There are like 80 schools who are test blind, and about 30 that are test required, but the vast majority of schools are test optional, where just like any other information, you choose, do I want them to see this? Will it strengthen? Does it help me or hurt me? And that calculus will vary from school to school. The exact same test score will help you here and hurt you here. And so part of it's understanding, am I on profile? Am I below profile with my testing? How outstanding are my grades and academic rigor? If my grades are amazing and my rigor is solid, but my testing is only moderate, do I want to have that test score in the conversation? If I have decent grades, but I have great testing, that's going to be, I definitely want that part of the conversation, assuming my test score is competitive and compelling for that college. Because even if I did great personally and I got a 29, I brought it up from a 22, I'm applying to a school where the median score is like a 33, that's probably not going to help me. And so it's trying to calibrate my score for a given school is really important. Test scores still matter for a lot of colleges, and even schools where it's test optional. Optional and test blind are very different things. There are many schools where it's optional, but it's an important part, if you send it, of your application. And there's been a lot of grade inflation over the past 20-30 years. That's just a fact. And there are a lot more kids who have A's than they used to. And so what that means is, test grades are not as predictive as they used to be. Testing is still a separate indicator of how you'll do first year and graduation rates and so forth. They're good predictors. And also for schools who are comparing broad applicant pools, having a test score is helpful, it's efficient. And it can help differentiate schools who otherwise might look similar. Having a really good test score, it's like having really good other aspects, like having a bunch of good AP scores that can differentiate you from kids who don't have that. Having a lot of leadership at your school. These are things that aren't required, but they can benefit you. I mentioned some other schools. Oh yeah, like Tennessee, Purdue. They're always adding a few more, and there'll be more added this summer. Essentially, schools are looking and waiting and seeing, but also they're trying to figure out this summer what's going to happen with the Supreme Court, what's going to happen with affirmative action. That may affect how many more schools become test required, because it's all tied up in that in terms of test scores and all these different things. So there are schools like Auburn that are entering this new realm of it's test optional given you have a certain GPA. So if I have a 3.6, test scores aren't required. I have a 3.52, test scores are required. And so there are schools like that. There are more of them coming out where it's conditional, test optional. And then also test scores can affect merit-based aid. It can affect admissions. Do I get in? But also how much will it cost me? My niece, who I just saw on Saturday and Sunday, came in for the Ed Sheeran concert, which I attended, which was actually really fun. He's pretty cool. A lot of hits. And she was here. She ended up going to, she lives in Richmond, and she applied to Alabama. She ended up getting a 1390 on the SAT. So they gave her the UA scholarship. And that consists of, if you're given a 3.5 GPA, which most kids have, your tuition, from Richmond, went from $30,000 a year down to about $6,000 a year. So in that case, the test score was really powerful, really compelling. She was going to save about $96,000 over the 4 years because of her test score and her grades. And so there are many colleges who give merit-based aid, and testing is still part of that calculus, part of it for many schools, not for all by many means. Some are just grades. So the question is, like, if I have a test score, I get a 1350, do I send it? Well, it depends again on the strength of your application, the strength of the school. Is it going to help or hurt? And also, will it put me in the running for a certain merit-based scholarship? Will it help me in that regard? The question is, do kids with test scores do a little better in the process? If they're applying to University of California, no, test scores don't matter. But other schools, it matters. One school, as an example of an extreme, an outlier is Boston College, where you had 17,000 kids apply with test scores, 20,000 kids apply without test scores. Who got in? 5,000 got in with test scores, which is an admit rate about 30%. And 2,500 kids got in without scores, which is about 10%. So it's almost a 3x, the kids getting in with test scores. This is unusual. This is, on the extreme edge, but part of it, and also be mindful that, the kids with test scores who send them tend to have good test scores. And typically kids with good test scores tend to have better grades and more academic rigor. So those things do align. It's called collinearity or correlation. And so you can't, but then there's something called causation, where if two kids apply from the same school, similar course taking, similar grades, one kid has a 34, one kid has no test scores, that 34 becomes part of that conversation and can influence the outcome. Here's some other schools. UVA, I have to update this data because the UVA advantage is now, it's more than double kids getting in with test scores. Notre Dame, it's almost double. Fordham is lesser. So certain schools put more of a premium on test scores. Fordham, 30%, Tufts, it's about half, Barnard half, Wellesley almost double, Emory is about double, Colgate's more than double. So there, again, certain schools seem to have a preference for kids with test scores. So again, it's not required by any stretch, but not required doesn't mean that it's not a factor in the conversation. So do you have test scores? Do you send them in? Get your baseline tests, get both, SAT, ACT. Figure out, read their language. Some of them say, like, we recommend testing, not required, it's optional. And then if you're below the range, typically I look at that middle 50th percentile range. And am I at least halfway? Am I midway or above? And if so, I'll probably send it. If I'm below the halfway point, I got a question. If I'm in the bottom quartile, if I'm below the midpoint, I tend not to send scores if I'm in the bottom quartile for submitted scores. All right. Again, do you want them to see the scores and so forth? Treat every school differently. Again, like my niece had a 1390. She applied to 8 schools. That test score went to 4 schools and didn't go to 4 others. And one of them, like, she applied to Tulane. They were explicit. If you don't have a 1430 or above, we don't want your test score. And, like, don't send it. And she didn't, and she got into Tulane. So part of it is like listening when the reps say we want a 1430 or above, attend to that. That's real. They know what's competitive for their school. And but again, certain schools she sent, she got into Georgia, got into other USC, other places with her test score, and that helped her, I believe. All right, so finally, let's talk momentarily about the digital test that's coming. And some of you on this webinar are probably sophomores, rising juniors, I'm assuming. Some of you may be freshmen, rising sophomores. For all of you, you are going to have the opportunity to take either the paper SAT. There are about 5 more left in history. We're going to have an SAT. There'll be an August SAT that's paper. Then there'll be October, November, December, and that's it. Then paper is gone. And in March, SATs become digital. It's computer adaptive. So there'll be some kids who hedge, who take a paper copy in December or in October, and then they'll ship the digital in March, in May and June. And I'm actually a pretty big fan of the digital SAT. I'm honestly a fan of digital testing in general for a lot of reasons. But a lot of kids, they've already been giving this exact same test overseas to our international students. They administered a March SAT that was digital, and in May, and the feedback has been pretty positive. When students have in one of the pilots, when they gave kids a paper test and digital test, the preference for digital was shown by 8 of 10 kids. So the majority of kids who take the paper and digital, one of the main reasons, they knock off an hour of testing. It's shorter. Kids like shorter testing. They're knocking off a ton of items. And so you're giving kids a lot more time per question, where it's pretty dramatic. Like looking at the digital SAT versus the ACT, you have about 60% more time per question on the SAT compared to which is incredible. It's so much more time. Like you have a minute per question on math. On the ACT, you have 95.5 seconds per question on the digital SAT, which is so much more spacious. You have a calculator built in always. You have these really short passages. You have far fewer word problems. They're really reducing the reading burden on the SAT math. That was a thing that they really blew it up on the Common Core realignment in 2016, but now they're backing off. It's going back to pure math, less reading. And I don't know, our kids seem to like it. And there are other tools in there that are very helpful. It's easier getting accommodations, you get your test scores back. They're shooting for like about a week. Right now it's about 10 days, 12 days, but they're going to make it even faster because there's no paper, there's no Scantron to mail. And there's no, you can't miss grid. It's all, you answer and you can see on the bottom if you omitted any or skipped any. It's pretty cool. And you can have the timer, you can hide it or show it. And there's no more reliance upon the proctor to call out times. It's all right there. So I don't know. In the grand scheme of things, I think that the digital SAT is going to be very popular among students. And again, the main thing is the whole administration is 2 hours and 20 minutes. That's awesome. It used to be about 4.5 hours with the essay and everything else. Now it's down to two and change. So it's, I think, a better test for a lot of kids. All right. Does our company offer digital SAT practice test? Yes, we do, all the time, every day. So you can, and also you can go on, we'll give you a very rich, detailed feedback when it comes to that. So it's just applerouth.com, info at Applerouth. You can sign up and we can get you onto a practice test. Additionally, if you're curious to find out what does the test look like, the actual format, the application that you're going to be using is called the Blue Book app. You Google SAT or College Board Blue Book app, and you download it onto your computer, onto your laptop, onto your tower. And then it's the exact same thing. It's the same format, same structure, same everything that they're going to use on the official SAT. So if you're curious, you can go and take the real thing today. There are 4 practice tests. Don't use them all because it only saves them for practice, but it's very helpful and handy. And so there really is no mystery in terms of what is it. You can go take it right now. But also I think the Applerouth one, we give richer feedback, which is very intentional. There's not as much feedback when our kids getting back their March tests and their May tests, because these tests are adaptive. Where you're going to go from a baseline test to an adaptive, easier, harder module, and also different items have different weights and scoring. It's item response scoring. They don't give you back your score report ever again. Like they don't even tell you how many questions you got right or wrong. It's just here's your score, and they give you a general sense of how you did in terms of like these 7 blocks on each set. They don't give you missed number 13, and there's no more test return. They're never ever going to give you back your test, but at Applerouth, we're going to make sure that our practice tests are really rich and robust. So that's part of the, it's kind of more complicated scoring. And so they're never going to give you back, here's how you did. It's just, you got a 1430, you got a 7, that's like the GMAT. They don't tell you which ones you missed or so forth. That isn't a thing anymore. So that's, they used to give back the scores, but that's with paper only. All right. So why don't let me pause. That's about half an hour of me talking. And I want to make sure that I answer questions from the audience. And,
and then we'll do our interactive SAT. No, I'm kidding.
You ready? Let's do this, man. I'm ready.
A question came in from a private question. So I'll just say anonymous person asks, I'm really curious as my son's a sophomore and tested better at the PSAT than the diagnostic ACT. So we'll test prep for SAT, but my son's PSAT was a written test and the spring of his junior year will be digital SAT. So do you anticipate that digital SAT will help predict his paper PSAT? Will be predictive of his paper PSAT? Should he do paper SAT in winter before the digital SAT
Here's
comes
how
out?
this works.
Yeah.
Between October 2nd and the end of the month, everyone in the country who's taking the PSAT will be getting a digital PSAT. So that the PSAT goes digital in October. That's, 4 months away. So you're going to have, and they promised the results back before Thanksgiving, which is new. Again, digital is faster delivery. And so you're going to have a practice test. Our experience is these things are pretty well calibrated and the content doesn't change that much. The delivery mechanism changes. We're going from fixed paper and Scantrons to a computer, but kids are very savvy with computers. That's not really a big change for them. And we're going from 140 items down to 90 items. We're going to a shorter test, fewer items. Ultimately our experiences so far is our students are making that pretty easy shift from paper to digital. So if you're curious, will the kid do better? You can go today to the Blue Book app, take a practice test, 2 hours, 20 minutes, and you have a score. And you can compare that score to your PSAT and see how it does. If you want to wait, again, in October, everyone's taking a digital PSAT. So for kids who are going to be juniors in the fall, they have 3 options. They have paper, SAT, digital SAT, or the ACT. And still, there are going to be some students who are going to do better on the ACT. Some kids who are pretty speedy, who are really good at STEM, who aren't as robust readers, they're going to rock out on the ACT. So both of them can still work, but I am pretty bullish. I think a lot of students are going to prefer the digital SAT to the paper version.
There's a question here from Margaret. Does the recommendation for the 3 official tests include the PSAT, or would you say that's separate?
I would say the PSAT is separate. The PSAT isn't a college admissions test. It doesn't go to colleges. So it goes to, the National Merit Corporation, but that's just for practice. It really is for practice and to give you information. So I would say typically taking it 3 times officially means 3 official SATs or 3 official ACTs. And again, not every student is 3 times. Some kids, again, they do all this practice, go in there and they're done. But over, looking at thousands of kids, the majority maxed out in their 3rd one.
This is Sonny's looking for admissions advice. 1520 SAT and 35 ACT. Should he stop taking the tests? His target school is MIT.
Yeah, 35 is great. I wouldn't worry about testing. MIT, if they're going to take you or not, the 35 checks every box for it's ultimately then everything else. And they take 4 of 100 kids. So your testing is one piece. But it's really, you are rolling the big dice when you're applying to any school under 5%. That's how that works.
Donna asks, are students allowed to use scratch paper when they take the digital test? How can they do math calculations, et cetera, without scratch paper?
All right. So the way it works, you are going to have 3 pieces of scratch paper. And if you want to need more, raise your hand, they bring you more. Additionally, a lot of the questions don't require scratch. A lot of the, and also, you can also, they have a built-in Desmos calculator right there. And a lot of the questions, you can just honestly plug it in. About half the items you can solve immediately with Desmos. And so the calculator becomes very important and calc fluency becomes very important. You can also bring your own calculator, and some kids think Desmos is amazing for graphing, but if you're trying to find the mean or median or some average using your own TI, that's pretty helpful. But yeah, Scratch is provided for math, it is.
Morgan asks, would you advise rising juniors who are stronger testers to try to finish it out on paper, or is there no reason to rush it?
You know what? We have 4 tests left that are paper-based, but I think the majority of students are going to actually prefer the digital one because it's more time, it's fewer questions, and it's shorter. So, I think there was a big push in 2015-16 to get it done before the big change, all the mystery. There's no mystery. You can go and take it tonight and see how you do. So I would say don't rush. If you're curious, take a practice PSAT, a practice SAT, that's digital, and look at your last year's PSAT and compare, where am I in terms of my percentiles? You'll have an answer within 2 hours and 20 minutes.
Awesome. One of the things that we talked about, Jed, a little while back was we talked about some practical ways to reduce testing anxiety.
Yeah, sure.
And I'm going to put in the chat a link to the blog that you wrote, that we posted along with the podcast. And I want to ask, and I'm going to say something for a minute, Jed, so you can kind of look back at that. But I'm curious to hear you riff on a few of these and which ones you feel like are sort of like the best ones to sort of combat anxiety, although it's a double negative, to promote peace of mind and calm feelings. But one of the things I want to say to y'all too is as you're thinking about this, first of all, I'll link also the podcast so that y'all can find that. Just scroll down to the episode with Jed and me so you can hear us talking about this years ago. I'm curious just to hear from you, Jed, like what are some of these as we look back? I mean, this is what, I don't know, 4 or 5 years old, but what are some of those tried and true things that you tell to students who do have test anxiety, that whether it's digital or paper, that you feel like still might apply today?
Yeah. And, the ability to regulate emotions is always, is clutch. It's going to be important forever. Every generation of students has to learn how to manage, the feelings. And when kids have a lot of anxiety, they're worried about their performance. And in terms of, they're applying to competitive schools and so forth, and they need a certain score. And part of it, I think, in the era of test optional admissions, I think there's less test anxiety because, it's more like submission optional. Most kids are going to get a test score and then you figure out, do I send it or not? And if I don't, before it was, I can't get in without a test score, which is really rare for the majority of schools, vast majority of schools. And, in terms of things to do, the tried and true methods, part of it is, getting a handle, like understanding that this is very common, that, when it comes to a high stakes test where your performance matters, whether it's on a college final, whether it's on an AP exam, I have kids I work with in college and their finals half their grade. And there's some arousal, some like this matters. Yeah, this matters. So part of it is using that, having a little bit of cortisol, a little bit of stress hormone, and using that stress in terms of for focusing, for attending, knowing that this actually matters. The whole thing is you go from eustress to distress when there's too much of it, and you have a hard time, and you begin to imagine, what if this goes wrong? And your energy and emotions are going to, what if this bad thing, and it's fear-based. You begin to imagine bad outcomes versus this is important, this matters, let me zone in and do the work. And then also, let me, just get my game face on. And so I think a lot of it has to do with normalizing it. A lot of students experience this. It's okay. Part of it is learning, what works for you to ground yourself. And this is really unique to every student. How do you calm yourself down when you're worked up? And what in some, often I talk about, what do you do like before a sporting event? If you're, a performer, well, how do you get yourself calmed down? I remember like watching Michael Phelps before his big events. He'd play music and he'd getting himself ready for this big event. And everyone has like, a mental rehearsal. You play certain things. I'm a big fan of using exercise to calm yourself down. Huge fan of a lot of our students, like, going for a run calms me down, or whatever it is. Using the body to kind of bring down the self-regulated emotions. Other people, it's, being nurturing. A lot of it's I statements also, like, what are you telling yourself? Because if your internal dialogue gets really negative, and it's, oh God, what if I screw up? And if that becomes what you're talking to yourself, then that just stimulates, there's more fear, and then it's a whole cycle. So part of it is giving yourself more calming, centering messages. I talked about, there's a great researcher out of Michigan, Ethan Cross, who's fabulous, talks about, your inner dialogue is so key. It's called Chatter, one of his great books. And about how do I calm myself down? And one of his things he likes to talk about is using like you statements, like, like Jennifer, Morgan, you've got this, you can do this, you're ready for this. So your inner dialogue becomes more positive, more nurturing, more centering versus, oh God, what if I screw up? What if I don't do, so like you're learning how to manipulate and work with your own inner dialogue, getting kind of wrangling what you tell yourself. And again, before you give a speech to the student council, like what are you telling yourself? And can I practice some much more positive internal dialogue, which is one of the keys of self-regulation. Other things, sometimes, you can bring a stone, a little thing that centers you. You can people use tapping. I've seen some kids, they tap, and like some of the touch calms themselves down. Some kids in the morning, there's a thing called havening, Havening, where it's kind of like doing these repetitive motions. And the body has these afferent nerves which respond to touch. I have a little baby right now, and when you touch, or I have a little daughter, right? When you calming touch calms us down, and that's physiological, and that sends like oxytocin and other things which counter the cortisol and the amygdala. So like doing some repetitive kind of calming, and even like like doing like some face thing like this, like doing like, and then it kind of grounds you. So that's kind of touch, like havening, tapping. These are using the physical body to calm down, the thoughts and cognitions, and it's all connected. We're all wired up. So I think, and also breathing. I didn't mention breathing because it's hard to be anxious and worked up when you're doing deep diaphragmatic breathing and practicing like breathing deeply, holding, exhaling, and so forth, and then practicing. And as we all take some deep breaths, we're going to feel our bodies calming down, because that's something called the vagus nerve, which affects cognition and emotion. And when the diaphragm is going back and forth, it stimulates the vagus nerve in the slow wave, and it tells the body to calm down. And so it affects your neurochemistry. So sleep, deep breathing, you could tense and release muscles, tapping, havening, self-talk, internal like I messages. These are all things, and part of it is learning what works for you. There are 25 things, and 3 of them might work for you, and then the other, and discard the rest. Not for me, not for me. That's fine. Find your recipe for how do you regulate your emotions, and use things in the past that helped you in the past. Like always build from your strengths, and do it. A quick review of what has worked when I was nervous about this or scared about this. Right, we would get going off the high dive. What did I tell myself? What did I do? How did I get myself centered? Can I use any of those tools here? That's important.
I love that. Thank you. That was a beautiful recap.
Yeah.
Morgan's curious. Do you think so? Super scoring, just for folks who missed it, super scoring is like taking one score from this, say the math from this one, and another score from another test. Do you anticipate that they're going to do super scoring across the old to the new SAT?
I think many of them will. It's going to be on a school-by-school basis. There's not going to be one policy, but I've heard, like we present with Sean Felton from Cornell, and he said, yeah, we're going to use it the way the college recommends, which says there's no difference. And part of it is this: there's no concordance. So a 680 on the new should concord and line up with the same on the old. So that's part of it why there shouldn't be a big difference. They're trying to make these tests so they really line up in terms of equating and so forth. So because of that, like in 2015-16, the test was totally recentered. And so the midpoint went from 1,000 to a 1080. And then college is like, well, we can't compare these. These are different tests. But now the midpoint was 1,000. The midpoint going forward is 1,000. So a 740 means a 740. So there's no equating. So, many colleges are going to say, yeah, we'll use them. But it's going to be on a school by school basis. And over the next, this is, going to be relevant in about a year, when kids are applying to college. And so not for this rising seniors, this is irrelevant, but for rising juniors, they're going to be applying, so it's, about a year and a half, this will matter. And we're going to see a lot more announcements between now and then. But I would say, don't count on a school super scoring, but I know for sure some of them will. We're going to learn a lot more in terms of the ratio of super scoring schools.
Awesome. Well, thanks. Are there any questions left? I mean, I think you actually, so this is like last call for questions from folks, but I think you actually did such a super job at hitting many of the questions in a short amount of time that I think that did zap a bunch of them, or at least it has for me, because I'm going, oh, I think you covered most of the things. And if nothing else comes in, why, we can end early.
Wrap early, but yeah, anything you want to know about assessments, about testing, about preparation?
You know anything about technical challenges with running the test digitally? Should that be
yeah. So one of the coolest things, I mean, they've done so much thinking about this. It shows in terms of how it was designed. And they learned from during the pandemic, when they had to administer the APs, 2 million APs digitally. One thing that they figured out is we want to have Wi-Fi matter for as little as possible. And so one of the coolest things about this is they're going to send you, when you log in to the Blue Book app, you're going to enter everything in, pre-enter all the stuff, and the test will actually download onto your laptop or your tablet before. It's going to be encrypted and locked until the code is entered. So the big Wi-Fi dump happens before. It'll actually download test and all of the possible lower high level sections that are the modules. So everything is baked in there. So you go to the testing room, and they'll tell you 1,000 times, charge your device, charge your device. You show up there, and there's going to be a coordinator or proctor who has their toolkit. They're going to give you the code, and then everyone ready, and the test is unlocked. So the only time you need Wi-Fi is for literally seconds when the code enters, and then it opens up, the encryption key gets, things are unlocked. And then for the full 2 hours, 20 minutes, doesn't matter. Wi-Fi can crash. There's no Wi-Fi. Everything happens on your device. If your device crashes, everything is being saved keystroke by keystroke to your hard drive and timestamped. So if I have 8 minutes left, I'm on number 33, things power down, I turn it back in and back up, same timer, and then boom, you're back on again. So if it crashes, nothing gets wiped. It's not in the cloud, it's all on your being hard, saved to your hard drive. And at the very end, when you're finished and tests are completed, all you're going to do is send up to the cloud your answer key, your answers, which is literally like a 5 kilobyte file. It's nothing. So you need Wi-Fi for a moment in the front with the encryption key, and in the very, very back for your answers or a text file. That's it. They're going to have a testing room for if you have any problems with power or connectivity. They're going to go, and they have a dedicated person who's going to be responsible for that technology support. And one of the cool things is that the proctors in every classroom, they have they're given tablets, and on the tablets they see every single student's progress in the room. It's all digital, they can see it. And so part of it is if there's a student who's not progressing or stuck, they say, "Hey, is something going on? Are you doing okay?" They can actually see you stalling digitally on their tablet, which is really neat, I think. Cool. So they raise your hand, like they're going to come to you and say, "Are you okay?" And all of our students internationally, a lot of our kids in England and other places, any issues, it was having to do with entering the code, make sure that was right. But the issues were minimal, absolutely minimal. And for all of our 100+ students internationally to take the March in May, we've had like no negative feedback, which is incredible and so different than the ACT rollout in 2018, 2019, when it was totally reliant upon Wi-Fi and power. And when the grid went down, kids lost everything. It was a whole mess. But this is just a better design, honestly. Having your own device is what's so different. And that really, and also you can practice on your own device, and you're practicing on the same device, you're taking the real thing on. So there's so much, I think there's going to be less anxiety because of that. Because it's already familiar. Oh, here's my laptop with my stickers and my things, and that I've practiced 10 times on this laptop. So the room is different, but everything else is the same. So there's so much less novelty now. And there's no Scantron, there's no rustling of paper I hear, someone makes me nervous. No, this is my computer doing what I know how to do. I don't know. I mean, it's cool.
Yeah, I appreciate you getting into the details there. Sarah asked a great question. Now, this is fun fact, or I don't know if it's fun for folks, but I used to teach test prep, like whatever it was, 10, 15 years ago. And I had this session that I would do for like last minute tips. Sarah's asking if a rising senior student is taking the SAT this Saturday, and due to AP's final exams, hasn't had a chance to study yet, what tips would you have for a student? And I'm going to broaden this to like, Jed, what's your talk that you give or what are your last minute tips that you give to students when they're prepping?
Well, I would never go into a test cold.
Don't say that. It's too late.
No, I would spend 5 minutes.
Okay.
I mean, you have to look at the form and the structure and know what's coming. I don't want to be surprised. So there's no spending 10 weeks here.
Right.
But the absolute minimum, look through, get a sense of how much time I have per question, get a sense, and maybe do a question. We don't have hours here, but I would say, know when the breaks are, know how much time you have, know how to pace yourself, because pacing is important to calibrate that. I think when it comes to the current SAT, one of the important things is structuring your work for the math, and like translating from all the reading problems into math. So practice the translation. Do a couple practice problems, and one of the big things is to avoid careless errors or write more down. Don't do math in your head. Like write it down on the paper, ideally. And also, I'm a big fan because you have these longer passages on the current SAT. They're much shorter. It's just one paragraph, one question on the test coming in next March. But currently, it's like 100 lines of text and 10 questions. So you have to really actively write and read, annotate, take notes. So I would practice, annotate one passage, do a few math problems, do some practice, look at the structure, figure out how much time you have per question. I would say spend at least 30 minutes. Don't spend no time. I would never walk into a test just blind to what's coming. Make sure you have some preparation. So it doesn't have to be hours, but just at least half an hour.
Mhm. Yeah. Would you suggest take a practice test if they've got time?
Always.
Yeah. Even last week, right? I mean, even if it's like great tonight, I've got soccer, but afterwards, I mean,
Or break it up, do a practice section a night, just get comfortable with the pacing and the speed and what's coming, and also how the level of difficulty changes. So that's part of pacing too, knowing that there are harder ones, knowing like don't get hung up on any one question. On the current SAT, every question counts 1 point. That's one raw point, and they scale it up. That's not the case on the next one, where it's a different, they'll have different weights on different items. But on this one, which you'll never know also, by the way, that's all their internal scoring mechanism. But here, just don't get hung up after more than a minute and a half, guess, circle it, move on. And typically the more time you spend on a question, it's less likely you're going to get it right. And you can just waste tons of time when you're stuck. So my thing is it's only 1 point. Don't blow a bunch of easy ones by getting hung up on a hard one.
Yeah. Here's a good kind of case study specific one that I want to go specific on, but then I want to zoom back from, because I think other students might be interested in this. This is a question that came in as a direct message. What would be a strong study plan for a test that's going to be taken in, like, let's say 3 months? So this is an international student who's going to be taking the SAT this week and is expecting something in the 1300 to 1350 range, but their goal is to get a 1450. So let's assume 150 point increase in 3 months. So what would be your prescription for if a student was trying to improve their score by 150 points in 3 months? First, is it doable? And second, what is it going to take?
We do it all the time. It's very doable. And in terms of the level of dedication, preparation, I mean, you're going to want to, the question is, do you want to bring in a company? Do you want to go solo? Do you want to Khan Academy it? And everyone's different.
Both sides. Let's do, what's the free version? And then what's the paid version?
Yeah. So the free version, I mean, when I did this back, well, shucks, test prep really wasn't a big thing in 92, 93. That really wasn't there. I knew one kid in school, but things were very different. But ultimately I got a book and a book of practice tests, and one book of practice tests from the College Board and one book of strategy. I think I used the Princeton Review in 92 and 93. And I did practice, and I ended up knocking out every practice test I could. There were like, 6 of them or 10 of them. And I went through all the key strategies. And so I think in the current age, the Khan Academy, there are 8 practice tests. I plan on, and also there's some, I'd probably buy a guide to, some for strategy. And I'm partial to the Applerouth guide. I'm also partial, like there's Barron's is good, and Gruber's, Princeton Review. There are other good books out there. We like Barron's pretty good. So ultimately, it's for strategies, how do I solve the problem, then practice. And so and one of the key things is whatever you miss, those questions are gold. You have to figure out why you missed them. So every time you miss a question, bingo, awesome. Let me go through it. Let me explain why did I miss this question, how to make sure I don't miss it in the future. So really study your errors so carefully. Never just take practice and keep going. Like, no, stop. And then whatever you missed that's your gold. And I would just build, I would take a practice test ideally every 3 weeks, and then do practice. But you want to, make sure you knock out at least, 4 or 5 practice tests along the way, and then analyze the heck out of them. Khan Academy. Then the other option is you go with a tutor. You bring some, you go with a class, a summer program, or you do private tutoring. Those are more expensive, but they're also more efficient because someone's focusing just on what you need and what the errors you're making. So that's my sense. But definitely, buy a book or 2, use Khan Academy, watch the videos, and also, there are some free things out there, and free prep. A lot of companies like ours will give you a free practice test if you've already maxed out your prep for Khan Academy and then the College Board's 8. If you want more practice or practice in a certain area, I'm having a hard time with decimals or with fractions, and Google things if you looking beyond SAT decimal questions, that kind of thing.
Does ChatGPT work for that yet?
Chat GPT for SAT prep. You know, I mean, if you enter a question, it could solve most questions, especially for math. The same with like Wolfram Alpha, you know, that also can solve most math questions.
Yeah.
But I think if you're stumped, yeah, like Wolfram Alpha actually is pretty nifty. It shows you the steps as to solving it. But yeah, if you're curious, if you have Chat GPT, you want to throw it in there to see how do I solve this question? What's the best way to, you know, why not? So that is, you know, a relatively $20 a month, a cheap way to get some help. And hopefully they'll explain it in a way that makes sense. But otherwise, you know, a tutor can really meet you where you are. I think there's still room for both in the world. And yeah, there's a range.
Will you look into your foggy crystal ball for just a minute and give us a little, humor me with a little, where do you see testing going? I mean, I know that it could go lots of different ways, but I'm curious, based on where we're at in this historical moment, like where do you think, where could you see things going?
I am of the belief that there will always be some form of admissions test because of, you know, the grade inflation, because of the lack of standard, you know, grades aren't standardized. And there's real differences what a 3.9 means at one school versus different high school in terms of people's level of readiness. I think test scores help ground and anchor that. Also looking around the globe, every nation has a test, whether it's, you know, the CAST or the Gaokao or the A levels. There's always something that's the same for all students. Or in India, you know, so I think we'd be kind of weird, like one of the only industrialized countries with no assessment, for just trust the teachers that, you know, their grading cultures are consistent and fair and similar, and the kids are ready. So I think, and right now there was a big push in No Child Left Behind towards testing. There's kind of a swing now against testing, part of diversity initiatives and things, you know, there's a reason we're going this direction. But I think this test optional world, I think, is where we're going to hang out. I think test blind, California is doing what California does, and they're always out there doing their own stuff, as you know. But the world isn't jumping behind them. And there are schools like Bates and Bowdoin, they've been test optional for 50 years. They aren't test blind. And there's a reason for that. And I think I'd be surprised if there's this groundswell of let's ignore all testing. Because some kids do better. Some kids who are really disadvantaged do well in these tests. And it's kind of a way to showcase, hey, I'm something special here. And I have this skill of this thing, and versus I come from a high school you don't normally pay attention to, but I got 34. And so, whoa, then people take the, so I think test scores can help kids, they can help schools, but having it optional, then they can use them or not use them. So I think optional is kind of going to be the end state. I think testing goes digital, adaptive everywhere, always. Scantron is like from the 50s. Scantron is so ridiculous. So using that, and it gets wet and things get lost and the mail gets, it's a hot mess. And then someone steals one thing and then they share a test, and then the test is canceled across the nation, which has happened in the US for the ACT. It's happened all over, you know, Asia. They canceled all testing for Hong Kong and for Korea and for India. It's just, so the grand scheme of things, for security wise, it's all going digital. And eventually the ACT, it's all going digital, and adaptive just makes it shorter and more student friendly. So, and also the testing will get much more dynamic, away from A, B, C, D. It's going to be much more interactive. There may be like videos, you know, testing's going to look very different. It may not even feel like a test. And in the same way as this world of A, B, C, D answers does, it gets richer than it is now. So I think tests will get better. They're going to be used, but I think it's going to be still important as long as, you know, colleges are selective and kids want to go to college. And it's versus there may be some world where that things change. But we'll see.
Ted, I'm so grateful. This was lovely. I learned things. I hope other folks learned things. I imagine they did. And we'll certainly follow up everybody with more info on, you know, on Applerouth and the recording and the links that we discussed. Any final thoughts here, Jed, as we wrap? You want to
final thoughts? Well, I do like that, you know, I have some of my friends, they quote, weren't great test takers, and they felt it really changed their path. That if only I'd been in this, you know, and I didn't have a high enough score on the MCAT, I didn't get into the med school I wanted, or whatever it was. And if it was optional, I would have gone to a much better school or a different path. And now, like, being test optional does take away a lot of stress. There is always a pathway now, even with without test scores. So my sense is keep it in context. Is it something you want schools to see? If so, submit. If not, you know, you have other things, other strengths. There's more choice now. You get to choose, which I like, and I'm pretty sure this is going to be the world we live in for a long time. And so, just ideally prepare, see how you do, get your baseline first, compare it to the schools you're looking at, figure out does it make sense to prep? Am I in the range? Could I get up 4 points and be competitive, or am I 10 points away? In which case, just go with your grades and your rigor and everything else, and your essays and leadership and so forth. But I think this new world is a little bit lower stress, which I do like. I keep it all in context. I think stress less about this. And again, it's a submission optional world. I really think that. So otherwise, good luck. Do practice tests, and keep it all in perspective.
Thanks so much, Jed. I appreciate your time. And thanks,
Anytime.
everybody, for joining us. We'll see you soon.